and good evening to everyone who's watching.
Good. Merry Christmas. So, yeah, it's all going to be good. So, yeah, we are talking about 77 years ago today. So, when I put the plea out on Twitter a few weeks ago about presenting things from the German point of view, you know, you said you kind of rediscovered this battle. So, what kind of prompted you to come forward and talk about it today?
Because a few months ago, I sort of started reading about Lanzerath because of events that. Oh, am I coming through? Okay.
Yeah.
Back. Okay. I was looking back through some correspondence, which it'll become clear as we go along how and when. But really, earlier this year, that I picked up The Longest Winter by Alex
Kershaw.
Alex Kershaw. I should have mentioned I had an email from him last week. I'm sorry, Alex, if you're watching, I doubt it. So, and I read that because I'd only been exposed to the German point of view going back about 22, 23 years ago. So I did it back, as we were saying before the show, I did it back to front and read, was exposed to the German point of view as opposed to most people who would go straight in reading Alex Kershaw or one of the books that we'll just look at in a minute. So really only the last few months that I've looked at both sides together. And when you asked for a show, I thought, well, perhaps I can put something together that would be of interest, and particularly today, the 77th anniversary.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the original sources and what you've used there, because it's always good that we'll talk about, give us a synopsis first, then we'll talk about the sources. So this is everybody who knows the story will be aware of Lyle Boke because, I mean, legend, but I'll hand over to you to kind of summarize this.
Yeah, before anybody jumps onto the text, the photograph, Lyle, I've always been calling him Lyle Boke. Lyle Boke, I've heard two different.
Yeah, me too.
Different his name, but Mr. B or Lieutenant B. And if you know anything about Lanzerath, you know who he is. He was the commander of the INR, the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Division, the Checkerboard Division, and you know the event. Most people are aware of the events, and we'll go through as we're going. Everything will become clear. That's all I can say, really. But the synopsis on the right is what I call the synopsis from the book that never was, and I can say that with almost certainty, and that will become clear as well. So I'm using it as a sort of summary of the 16th of December in Lanzerath. Okay, so please excuse my Burton-esque voice, okay? So for centuries yet to come, readers of military history will study the valor and intrepidity, which is resolute fearless, fortitude, endurance, of the American GI who slugged it out with the Germans during the coldest European winter on record in the greatest land battle of the 20th century. The INR platoon of the 394th Regiment, 99th Division, whose heroic Alamo-like defense, 22 men facing 60-to-1 odds, against more than 2 battalions of German paratroopers, earned the recognition as the most highly decorated platoon in a single battle in US Army history. And like I said, that is the synopsis from a book that never was, and I'm 99.9% sure, and Alex Kershaw even agreed with me that he hadn't heard of this book, but this will become clear because we're going to cover that in a minute. So that's a sort of summary of what went on in Lanzerath that day, 77 years ago today.
And these are the original text. Well, we just mentioned Alex Kershaw. And Alex, of course, if you're watching World War II TV for the first time, go back and look through previous shows. You'll find Alex has been on talking about The Liberator, his book set in the winter of 44. And he's also been on talking about the Bedford Boys. And he's a well-known historian and journalist and writer and author and a chum of the show. And his book is a cracker. I mean, and so too are the other two you put up there. These are all standard works. If you want to look at the Battle of the Bulge, if you haven't got these books on your shelf, then you're kind of, you're an amateur, I would venture to say.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It'll become clear how I came to read these, because to be honest, I didn't really have an interest 23 years ago in the Ardennes, other than von der Heiter's airdrop 30 kilometers up to the northwest in the Barak Michel or Hoeven. That was my interest. You see, these small ground battles, I wasn't really interested in then. So I've only read these in the past few months to go to sort of counter the German perspective that I'd almost grown up with really over the past 23 years. So yeah, Alex Kershaw's book, if you want to know more about the Battle of Lanzerath, then you have to read that, because it's not just about Lyle Boke Lyle Book, it is about the men of the I&R platoon, whereas the other two books, the Battle of the Bulge by Hugh Cole, who was an intel officer during the Ardennes, it hardly mentions. There's a really brief reference to Lanzerath, and that's it. But Alex Kershaw, I believe I read somewhere that one of the caveats that Lyle Bouk put in when he was writing this book is it couldn't just be about him; it had to be about the men as well.
Yeah.
So it didn't then follow Eisenhower's The Bitter Woods, where it was just about him. It's about the men, and it is a fantastic story from beginning to end. You know, and in fact, the battle itself is just a fairly short chapter.
Yeah.
In the life story of the men of the I&R platoon. And he uses interviews, personal files, and the affidavits. He told me he used the affidavits that the men filled in all when it became politicized and all the lobbying to get the law changed to allow them to be awarded their decorations and things many years after the event. So highly recommended. Hugh Cole, I haven't read it all. I've read the chapters on the 99th Division and the next chapter, just to see how much Lanzerath was mentioned, because this was the sort of crux of this whole event being politicized years later, because they didn't get a mention for their efforts in that part of the Ardennes offensive, in the northern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive. They weren't really recognized for what they'd done. So I had to take a look myself, and it's right. It is a bloody good book. I kept reading on and on, but there's little reference at all. Oh, and Paul, you might I've put historiography there because that's a word you introduced me to.
It's one of my favorite words now. Yeah, I use it all the time. Yeah,
that and microhistory, because this really, I suppose you can say, and I'd like to thank Dr. Phil Blood for introducing me to the word microhistory. Thanks, Phil. And The Bitter Woods. The Bitter Woods is a really good book. How can we say? Lyle Bouk then, in the mid-60s, agreed to take part in this book project with John Eisenhower. So that's how really the story of the I&R platoon came out into the public domain, because nothing had been written about it in any detail. But I have found, even though The Longest Winter is 2004 US, 2005 UK, and The Bitter Woods was 69, there's still some conflict in the account, which you could put down to memory, I suppose. But there were a couple of bits where I was sort of, oh, crikey, okay, that's a bit of a difference. But the book is fantastic as well, and it's based on intel reports, after action reports, combat interviews, and from the German perspective, the old ETHINT A, B, C, and S series manuscripts that were written after the war, you know, while the Germans were in captivity. So 3 good books, but the middle one then, not much by Hugh Cole about Lanzerath. The other 2, yeah, there's quite a lot of detail.
But then we have the German. It's the German side that is your forte. And a reminder, folks, that Greg is the author of a fantastic book. The link is in the description below. I just put the overlay up on screen. Fallschirmjäger. It's to do with all your correspondence with lots of Fallschirmjäger veterans, sort of hidden stuff that hadn't been shared elsewhere. Your kind of micro study of one particular arm of German forces. So let's look with this today. What are your German sources for today's show? Right.
So the next 2 are the most common ones used by authors who do write, those who do include these sources, and even Alex Kershaw has used the next one we're going to go to, or extracts from it, and another one we're going to look at in a minute. So Der Vergangenheit auf der Spur, or On the Trail of the Past, by Fritz Roppelt. He was in the 12th Company. He was a mortarman. He was present in Lanzerath. He died in 1994, and he didn't complete the book. And his daughter continued writing it with the help of the veterans who had written it, helped to write the book with him anyway. And it's a 600-page history of the 3rd Division from its inception and building in late 43 through to the end of the war. And it is a beast, and it contains losses and places and all sorts of interesting information. And it was restricted to 200 copies. So a lot of this information about the Ardennes, it'll become clear in a minute. I keep saying that, but it was sent to me that had already been translated 22 years ago. So I'm reading this, and I'm reading the next source on the next slide, Paul, which is Opfergang Deutscher Fallschirmjäger, which is Sacrifice of the German Paratrooper by Rudi Frühbeiser. Rudi Frühbeiser and Lyle Bouk knew each other because we'll come to at the end, Rudy Frühbeiser. This work is normally referred to as Frühbeiser. The previous one is normally referred to as Roppelt by researchers. Okay, Frühbeiser invited back to the reunion in 1969. We'll cover that at the end. This was published in 66, so this was published before The Bitter Woods, and there's quite a chapter on the 16th of December, as you can imagine, because it was the opening day, and they played the 3rd Division, and the 9th Regiment in particular played a big part. So this book is a regimental chronicle of the 9th Regiment through 44, 45, so covers Normandy onwards. And again, produced with the aid of lots of other veterans within the 9th Regiment Kameradschaft. So again, it's a good book, and it's used by a lot of authors for the German perspective, because what we've got to remember is there's no official documentation around, and I'm 99% sure of that, because I've looked through the BDF, the Bund Deutsche Fallschirmjäger holdings, and I've looked through the BA, the Bundesarchive holdings, and I can find nothing about the 3rd Division or the 9th Regiment. Well, if there was, then they would have been used in books already. So there's a black hole there. There is a war day diary from the 8th Regiment, which was just to the south of them, but it only has some brief comments about the 9th Regiment. There's also a corps level KTB, which mentions the 9th Regiment. It's not specific.
Cool.
The next one's the Deutsche Fallschirmjäger magazine, which has been around since the early 50s. Now and again, throughout the decades, has articles on different battles and things. And one was written in there by, I'm not sure if it was Frühbeiser or not, but it was sent to me, translated years and years ago. And again, it was another German perspective that I sort of put away because I wasn't really interested then. And I've only sort of brought it out again in the last few months. The centre one, Hans Weiger's, again, it's a really good book because it's the only specific book written about the 3rd Parachute Division's involvement in the Battle of the Bulge. And Hans did a really good job. So he's utilised Roppelt and Frühbeiser and first-hand accounts by veterans, guys like Vince Kuhlbach and others. And it's a really good book. And of course, the first chapter is Lanzerath. So, you know, for me, it was good to see it. But I don't think he's used the extracts to the fullest from Frühbeiser. We'll see that in a minute, because there's something left out that we'll uncover in a minute. And then the Stephen Risiecki, I'm sure I've said it right, who's an ex-military, US military officer, wrote The Key to the Bulge, Battle for Lossheimer Graben, and that has a lot of information about Lanzerath. And again, that conflicts as well with the others. There's a lot of conflict in accounts that some you could put down to memory. I don't think he interviewed Lyle Book for this. I'm not sure whether it was correspondence or something like that, but other members of the INR platoon and the 371st Field Artillery, the men that were there, the 4 men, or the 3 men that survived. So there's a lot of good literature out there. But the other thing I wanted to add is also for this, I've utilized private correspondence with, and the author of this will be on the next slide. I'll introduce him in a minute. So I want to introduce 3 people who play a part in this. And this was over a period of about 6.5 years. The author of this got in touch with me for a completely separate reason, and we became friends. We ended up with a mutual friend, an ex-paratrooper who lived up in the northwest of England. I used to go and visit. And earlier this year, I was looking for a file in all my folders, and I just remembered I had these, and I remembered the words like Lyle Book, and I remembered Lanzerath. So I dug them all out, put them in date order, and then read it like a book. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. But I discounted it at the time, because when you get a letter, you just read the content and you reply to it, don't you? And you answer questions. So this time round, however many years later, it gave it a new interest. And this was the driver for me to then go and read Alex Kerschel's book. So we'll introduce the first of 3. This is Arnold Weisenberg. When he contacted me, he was the Kameradschaftsleiter, sort of the 3rd Division Richard Schimpf, so the 3rd Division Veterans Association, if you like. And of course, in his role as the KL, or 2KL, he may have been 2KL, He regularly visited veterans all over Germany, Austria, and some that lived closer to him up in, he was living in Bonn at the time. He used to visit weekly, you know, so he was exposed to all these accounts. And he was a veteran himself, you know, he was a third generation Fallschirmjäger. Before, he'd been Luftwaffe aircrew, and he was in hospital at the time in June. When he was discharged, he wasn't sent back as flying personnel. He was sent to Gardelegen to undergo infantry training, and then shipped off to 2nd Battalion, 8th Regiment in Holland or somewhere like that in October or whatever. And he himself was captured a few days before the Ardennes offensive began. It's funny because he became friends later with Lieutenant Peter Branton, who was the platoon commander of the guys that captured him, just up to the north of Düren, a place called Pier, near Inden. And he went into captivity. He stayed in Belgium while the offensive was going on. He wasn't shipped off from Ostend or Antwerp to the UK or US. He was actually kept with all the guys that had been captured from the 3rd Division. They were still in. So you can imagine if they'd been held and the Germans had got to Antwerp, they could have probably freed quite a few ex-paras if they got that far. But anyway, at the bottom, you'll see a typed snippet. This is from, I've used little extracts from his letters. So he told me that we are able to tell exactly what happened on this day, but none of the 20 guys likes to remember the few daylight hours and the bloody results. That was back in 2000. He had become quite passionate about it because he spent a lot of time with guys who had been there, you know, on that day and the other days. Let's not forget that Lanzerath wasn't just the only battle they took part in on the 16th, which we'll come to in a minute. But this is an enigma for me, and this is Dr. Burnett Morrell Fraser, or Dr. Fraser. Arnold described him as, just called him Dr. Fraser from El Paso, Texas, like that was an extension of his name. So I used to laugh every time he mentioned him because he always said it like that. The extract, the book extract, the synopsis that I mentioned at the beginning is from a book that he was writing called Hold at All Costs, The Alamo of the Ardennes. And I know there's a similar title book out at the moment, which is about Bastogne. This was specifically about the Battle of Lanzerath on the 16th of December. And I cannot find much about this chap at all. Alex Kershaw had not heard of him, and you'd think he would because his research and book writing was running concurrently with Alex's Longest Winter in the early 2000s. It was supposed to be ready twice during that period you see there on the right. But Arnold started mentioning him in his letters because he had written to Arnold asking if he could provide veterans to give both sides of the story. But I don't know if it was both sides. I know that Dr. Fraser was friends with Lyle Bark. He was friends with other veterans, Peter Branton, Dick Byers. Apparently he was connected to them as well. And you can see he's fairly well connected because Christmas Day 1970, 4 months after I was born, he sat there with Albert Speer and his wife. Because Speer had just released his memoirs. And for whatever reason, Fraser was with him interviewing him. I know he had done an article on Rudolf Hess. I can't find anything else about him. But anyway, this book is the book that never was. All right. And another snippet at the bottom. This is Arnold talking to me. Do you know the whole story of Lanzerath as it happened on the 16th of December with the INR platoon led by Lieutenant Book? There are so many tales, and Dr. Fraser will tell the real truth. To me, it looks impossible. Well, of course, when I was reading this, I was sort of thinking, well, yeah, well, maybe he does know the truth. I don't know. But I just discounted it all because I was just blinkered on the German side at that point before I'd read everything else. And then quickly, I want to introduce the third person. In the top left there, old friend of mine. This is Heinrich, who lives in Virginia, East Coast, US. Lovely guy, who got in contact with me about 20 years ago, asking if I knew anything about his father. His father, Heinz Fick, who was the company commander of the 2nd Company 9th Regiment, who'd been at Lanzerath. And luckily, I was already in correspondence with Arnold Weisenberg, and he's the best man. If you want to find out about your father, and I'm in touch with the guy who knows men who served him and knew him, I passed him on. And anyway, it ended up that Heinz traveled to Germany, visited his father's grave in Recogne-Bastogne, if my pronunciation is right, the grave you can see on the right. And Heinz recently, only last week, was kind enough to send me some more photographs I've put on the screen, but also a copy of the field post letters that he sent from the end of 44 until the day he was seriously wounded in January. So I've got some extracts as we go, some extracts. And it's the usual sort of field post letters. You know, he had a young pregnant wife at home, pregnant with Heinrich, who was born in the summer of 1945 and never knew his father. So you can understand why you want to meet people who knew his father, served with his father, you know. So yeah, the letters, it's the usual sort of concern for your wife during war, expressing, you know, love for his pregnant wife, but also he gives snippets, operational snippets as well, which is quite interesting to read. So I only got them last week and trying to incorporate them into this presentation. So thank you, Heinrich.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. So yeah, introduction to who the Fallschirmjäger Division 3 are and what they've been doing before the Ardennes, I think would be appropriate at this juncture. Yeah,
because, you know, we're going to jump straight ahead into 77 years ago today, and it's just really to highlight the difference between the heady days pre-D-Day and the state, well, not the state, you know, the status of the 9th Regiment in particular, of the 3rd Parachute Division on the 16th of December. That it was a completely 180-degree turnaround on what was here. 16th of February, those two photographs taken in Finisterre and Brittany. You can see they're well armed, they're well equipped. So I think Niels Henkemans might actually be able to correct me if I say that at this point in time, well, they had something like 954 MG42s within the division, and the 17,000-man division, you know, that's almost one every 17 men. So they had some good firepower. That all they were really missing was the mobility, because as you know yourself, on the 6th of June, they could only send a battle group up towards Cerisy, Forêt de Cerisy, under Friedrich Alpers. But you know, they spent months training from their initial build, the end of 43, and they were really a really effective unit in Normandy. And this is something I want to look into after, now that I've done the Ardennes bit. And I know Niels is doing it, so you know. Anyway, yeah, the heady days. And the next slide, Paul, just goes through, you know, I'm not trying to pity them because they all these battle locations, but it's just to indicate how you can see they've been worn down over those months in the fighting in Normandy, you know, in the Fallais pocket, taking loads of casualties. And this is at the end, almost at the end of the campaign in France. The commanding general was wounded himself in the Fallais pocket and was replaced. The Mons pocket in Belgium, that's, in fact, that's something I'm looking at as we speak, is the Mons pocket, because I think that's overlooked a bit from the 3rd Division point of view. And they lost a lot of men captured in the area around Mons. Then Holland, you have this camp group action in Holland. And then the front line up near the Herkenwald, again, they lost a lot of losses in November, actually, in 1944, 1,380 losses they suffered, the division suffered, just up in that area. But you can see at the bottom there, the total losses in June, July, and August. This is from Roppelt. I don't know how accurate it is, but the totals are 9,500 men. So they were drip-fed replacements during Normandy, but they're basically hemorrhaging all the way through that. And it wasn't until early October that they were sort of rebuilt in Holland. And that's when you start to get the mass influx of flying personnel. You were talking about this the other night on one of your shows. You know, the level of guys, the quality had gone down. Although I don't think all of them were poor quality, as we'll see in a minute. But the photograph on the left, you know, that was a rare sight in today, 77 years ago, a Cretan Africa veteran with the Iron Cross First Class Sergeant, you know, with all the kit, because he's a veteran. That would have been quite a rare sight 77 years ago today in Belgium.
Yeah, they had crosses over their heads mostly by this point of the war, and yeah, it's the feature of what we talked about with Peter on Monday, is that not that we're going into the reasons behind the German offensive, but it is the final roll of the dice for the Germans. It's an all or nothing. It's if you played the Colditz board game, it's the do or die card you're playing now, isn't it? it's a desperate act of an army that's falling apart, running out of everything. But
oh yeah, definitely it is, and we'll see that as we go along in a minute. When Schimpf was wounded, there was a succession, a couple of temporary commanders. Then it was taken over by Major General Walter Verdane. And you can see by that sort of short bio there that he wasn't a paratrooper. He'd had some ground combat experience, ground command experience with the 10th Luftwaffe Feld Division. But, you know, one thing you can say, the picture I've built up of Verdane is he was a compassionate guy who cared about his men. That's the one thing. He might not have been a fantastic field commander, but you know, I did hear from veterans that they did like him while he was in temporary command during the Ardennes offensive. And again, there's a little quote there. That's from Roppelt. After General Verdane read out the OKW order, so that's on the 15th of December in Stadtkiel, for the Ardennes offensive, obviously. He said, "Gentlemen, if this blow does not succeed, Germany will not be able to deliver a second one." So you can see the pessimism, like you were saying to Peter the other day about senior commanders who think, you know, oh, Jesus, we can hardly do this, but we got to, and we've only got one shot. That's it. One shot. And if it fails, that's it. The war's going to come a bit closer. The end of the war. And then we move on to Colonel Helmut von Hoffmann. Much has been written about this chap. Described as an unassuming middle-aged staff officer from Berlin, which doesn't really do much for your reputation, does it? And it's funny because he went on to serve in the Bundeswehr in '56, yet you'd think that this guy would appear in one of the post-war interviews, you know, the ETHIN, the A, B, C, and S series interviews, but he doesn't. I can't find anything. And you'd think that he would be someone of interest to the Allies, you know, because he'd been a regimental commander and he was with them through December. He went off sick in March. Yeah. But this guy had been a staff officer right back to the early days in the German army. He did do his parachute training in April '44, but that doesn't make you a great commander, does it? And he was hospitalized with pleurisy the day before D-Day. So maybe he had a premonition. And he didn't come out again until August. He had a succession of short appointments. I did read somewhere he became the Stadtkommandant of Eindhoven for a few days until they probably kicked him out and replaced him with someone else. I don't know. But he ended up being the commander of the 9th Regiment, and through the Ardennes offensive and through the day that we're talking about 77 years ago. And we'll also talk about the altercation between him and Piper just after midnight, 16th, 17th. And
in a weird way, Greg, just to add to what you're saying, is that at this point, whether you were a good regimental commander or a bad regimental commander, you had little impact or involvement in the plan because it was all coming from the Hitler. It's all coming at the top. And no one is, you know, as we discussed with Peter Caddick Adams, no one is questioning it because post-July plot, every German officer in the high command is worried about being incriminated in that. So everyone's just saying yes, 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 and agreeing to everything. So you're holding a poison chalice in a sense as a commander. You have very little room for maneuver. You're given your orders, you're given your objectives, you're told what to do. Okay, you can influence a little bit how you move your men across the ground, but essentially it's not your plan anyway, is it?
No, well, that's very true. Yeah, and you get the impression that he was just. I think Alex Kershaw mentioned something in his book about he'd be quite happy to sit the war out, you know, somewhere, but he finds himself right in the front line. You know, I'm a staff officer. Oh dear, let's just try and make the best of it if I can, and if I survive, then fantastic.
Yeah, good. So, yeah, here's the breakup of Fallschirmjäger-Regiment 9. So I'll explain. For those who are looking at that like it's a foreign language, I'll let you explain what that is. Niels is looking at that and rubbing his hands in glee.
Oh, yeah.
Niels knows exactly what that is. But for those of us who don't read German orders of battle, what does that all mean?
Right, I know that Niels is probably saying now that, oh, he's omitted the staff and the Sturmzug, and I apologise, Niels. I'll get that out there now. But it's just to highlight what was within the regiment itself. So 3 battalions, I suppose at this point of the war, we could call them infantry, parachute infantry battalions, as opposed to, you know, and the regimental units, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Company, which also play a part on the 16th of December. And it also there gives you on the eve of the Ardennes offensive the manpower. So they're fairly small battalions, 300 to 450 men. And the companies are the 1st Battalion, and you can see Heinz Fick, their 2nd Company, and they're all. If you look back to Crete, company commanders were more often than not Oberleutnant, rank below, and now you've got captains, but they're not Fallschirmjäger. They're mainly. Niels has just said something. I saw it. I saw his name flash up. Yeah, right to left. Yeah, I thought he'd say something like that. Tell him it's back.
For those who are unfamiliar, because it's sometimes these shows feel a bit like a kind of a boys' club of friends, which is good because we are a boys' club of friends. But those who aren't aware, Niels has done a couple of shows with us, and we are waiting with bated breath for his
Books.
2-volume study of the Germans in the Cotentin in Normandy, which are going to be absolutely great, groundbreaking, game-changing for anybody who's a student of Normandy. And Niels is just all of us is go-to guy about German units in terms of their organization, formation, and what they have and what kit they have. Niels is just a legend. I hope he's going all red with embarrassment now, but Niels, you are a legend.
No, he won't. He's laughing at my slide. Tell him it's flipped back to the other way around. Anyway, so yeah, it's just to give you an idea who's going to be involved in Lanzerath. And I just want to mention about the journey to the Ardennes, because they had to get from where they were in Germany, in Düren. But before that, I need to read something from Heinz Fick's field post letters, which is about the journey of the divisional journey from Holland to Germany.
Right.
Where is it? During the night of the 20th of November 1944, the newly drawn up 3rd Parachute Division was transferred to Düren to be used in the fighting in the Ruhr area. This transport was accomplished by German trains. Final destination was Elsdorf near Düren. When the trains arrived there, they were bombed by Allied planes. It was said that this transport was betrayed to the enemy. The 9th Regiment suffered heavy losses there. So he mentions this attack on trains and that it was a stitch up. Whether it was or not, what targets were in Elsdorf, I don't know. But I thought I'd read that out because that covers the sort of journey from Holland to their movement east, northeast, back to Germany. Then the 9th Regiment get their orders at 1700 hours on the 10th of December. They're moving south. So this is preps for the Ardennes offensive, what's coming up. So 1,200 men, 9th Regiment, they've been relieved by Volksgrenadiers. Not all of them, mind. Some of the regiment had to stay behind and they had to catch up. So they only had 61% of the infantry combat strength, and they had to move south to Kells and then further down through Germany. Then was actually about 67, well, it depends, it could be 80 kilometers. I've just put the street map on there from Google, but it could be more than 60 to 70 kilometers. But the men had to carry their own ammunition and equipment. Fortunately, the weather was hazy, there was light snowfall, and therefore no Jagdbomber activity, because they had suffered up in the north there by Düren, in good weather, clear skies. They had suffered under the ABOs and suffered quite a few casualties. So that was the sort of baptism of fire from the air, was the fighting around Düren. But of course, as they march south, imagine that, marching south for all that distance, carrying everything because of the lack of mobility. Again, they're haunted by lack of mobility, as they were in Normandy. It seems to be haunting them. And then phase 2, which was from Schuyler. So they arrived in Schuyler on the 14th of December. And on the afternoon of the 15th, the commanders were called to a secret meeting. So they don't know what it's about, these guys. They just know that the commanders have been to a secret meeting. Upon their return, the regiment set out on the march to Scheid, which I think is about 15 kilometers. On the way, we passed piled up war materials and equipment. MP stood everywhere, directing men and traffic. So you can imagine, all this build up of men and material, it's lying around, and troops going this way and that way to their assembly areas. So it's quite dramatic. But also about this time, General Vadane, he had complained about inadequate communications equipment because he knew he'd have to have good communications equipment once this offensive began, radio and wire equipment. But also he complained that his troops' clothing was in tatters and he had no winter clothing because these guys had just, they'd gone through the hell in the area up around Duran from air attacks and attacks by Americans in all those little towns and villages around. Plus then they'd done completed an 80-kilometer march, plus another 15 carrying all their kits. So you can imagine they were in a bit of a ragged order, you know. So, and there was nothing to replace that kit. And they had no snow camouflage because the further south they got, the snowier it got. You know, the weather was, as they got down into around the Eifel region.
And I just want to make my takeaway from that comment is even on the 10th of December, they're talking about light snow because, again, as Peter Caddick Adams said, there's this perception that the Ardennes offensive started not in snow, and then some days later the snow started. But the point he was making, it all depends where you are and what altitude you're at. Are you on a mountain? Are you in a valley? Because it's not like the Ardennes has snow or doesn't have snow. Even the photos I saw over the weekend for the commemorations, some of them had snow in, some of them didn't have snow in. It all depends where you are. So we mustn't get in this idea of it being that there's a blanket type of weather there that is consistent across the whole battlefield. Some places there is snow, it settles, it goes, it comes back. It's just one of those things I think is worth mentioning, that it comes and goes. Exactly.
And Heinz Fick, in a letter on the 12th of December 1944, he puts, since then we are mostly camped out on the open road and have marched on foot for 60 kilometers. The men have big loads to carry and the items they could not carry are being wheeled along on push carts. They are very hard to move in the mountains. We moved south and now we are in the grim Eifel region. Winter is ensconced here with snow and frost, unlike down in the valleys. What we will do now and how and where we will be deployed is still uncertain. So he wrote that about that trip southbound as well, that, you know, the weather got worse as the further they got south and got higher up in terrain.
Just a quick question from Peter O'Connell for you, Greg, and it's just, you talked about the makeup of these people coming in from flying Luftwaffe units, this, that, and other. What kind of training have they had before they joined the Fallschirmjäger? I guess there's more than one answer to that. It depends when they joined, but it's anything from not very much to barely enough, I suppose, is the answer.
Well, let's talk about the October rebuilding. Heinz Fick is a good example because he had been in command of a company of replacements and was finally sent west to Holland, to Enschede, or is it Oldenval? I can't remember which town it is now. There's three towns very close together near Enschede. And he was surprised that he joined a Fallschirmjäger division because he shows his surprise in a letter to his wife about, oh, you know, I'm in a parachute division now. So he obviously didn't know where they were going. But then once they joined, he maintained command. They didn't replace him. And I think that was down to that he had good leadership qualities. Yeah. Because even if you've not got the ground combat experience, if you've got the leadership and the man management skills, then, you know, like he had to do in Holland, was some quick, intense training. They'd already had some training, but then it was like the divisional level of how they do things. And he stayed in command of his company during these field exercises. Then he'd have to come back and do all the additional admin associated with officer duties, you know. So he proved himself to be, but obviously he hadn't had his baptism of fire yet. So unlike the 3rd Division pre-Normandy, where they had several months of training, intense training in Brittany, these guys only managed to get 2, 3, maybe 3.5 weeks before they then deployed to Germany around Düren. So they did get some intense training. I can imagine it being quite intense, driven by the experienced officers and senior NCOs and things. I can imagine them getting quite intense, but they hadn't had their baptism of fire, these replacements, yet.
But the point is, as you said earlier, Greg, is there is this sprinkling of NCOs within a regiment like that who have been there and done it. You know, there may not be many of them, but even if it's just 10% within a company, you've got some experience. That can sometimes be just enough to explain to the others how to move across ground, when to keep your head down. Just give them that kind of battle experience. And let's be honest, when we get to the American units we've been talking about that are facing some of this advance, that they're pretty much all green. Like the 99th only arrived in Northwest Europe in October, so they've had barely 6 weeks to get acclimatized to Europe. So even a sprinkling of veterans is maybe just enough to give this unit enough of a backbone to kind of move into combat with some kind of reasonable chance of moving well.
Yeah, exactly. And the 9th Regiment, even though they were only at 61% of their strength, they still had quite a few experienced NCOs who had either been with the division pre-Normandy or had gone through Normandy, Belgium, Holland. So that they had quite. Unfortunately, they lost quite a few of them on the 16th of December. But yeah, they did. So they did experience some quite intense training, field exercises, and live fire exercises, things like that. So they weren't just thrown into the division and used as cannon fodder. They did actually have some training.
But now we get to the advance. So 77 years ago.
The busy old slide, this mate, with top graphics done by myself. I've also put the advance, as you can see it. The red is the 9th Regiment, as I see it, as I interpret it from the sources that I've got put together. The light blue is the 8th Regiment and the 5th Regiment. The 9th Regiment, their sort of entry point into the frontier was at Lossheim, the old train station in Lossheim, which they shared with the 27th Fusilier Regiment, which is their right flank partner, whose ultimate goal was the Buchholz area. So they both crossed, whereas the 5th and the 8th came slightly to the south, because there's no mention of them crossing. It's just the 27th Fusilier and the 9th crossing at Lossheim. So I've put that in because I know that the 8th Regiment, for example, came through Almuten and Afst and then on to Manderfeld, where the 5th went straight down to Cravinkel. In fact, they suffered more casualties down in Cravinkel than occurred in Lanzerath, but you don't see Cravinkel getting the same sort of coverage as Lanzerath. But anyway, 9th Regiment, I know from the text that after Lossheim they had suffered, and a lot of this is done through losses that I've pieced together, as we'll see in a minute, because the losses tie in with the route, if you see what I mean. So I can see how many men were killed in these little villages, and makes it easier to tie this all in. So in Hergesberg first, after crossing the frontier, and when I was reading Hugh Cole the other night, it was Hugh Cole, described this sector as containing islands of small islands of resistance, American resistance, platoon level and nothing major, all facing east. So they around the towns and the hamlets and the villages, which I thought was quite interesting. These small islands of resistance. They might have machine guns, they might have a mortar, they might have an anti-tank gun, because the German advance does come across anti-tank guns, single anti-tank guns. So then the 1st Battalion advance in the Hulscheid, but you can just see the little village of Berterath there. I'm sure that someone will pick me up that there was a tiny battle within this advance between Hergesberg and Berterath, but I can't prove it myself, so I haven't put it in. So we're moving up to Hulscheid, which is really the first place where they come across resistance from American troops. And they suffer quite a few casualties in Hulscheid, the 9th Regiment. The 2nd Battalion, it would appear that they leapfrogged a little bit more to the north and around into Merlscheid. So you've got the 1st Battalion going into Hulscheid, the 2nd going around into Merlscheid, and they too coming up against fairly stiff resistance. In fact, was it five men from the 15th Company were killed in one mortar shot into a house in Hulscheid that they were in. So it was quite stiff resistance they met. And also, this was the first time they were exposed to war booty. So you can imagine, as the Americans pulled out, my God, they're coming across coffee, cigarettes, a fire, hot coffee, rations, and things like that. So that gave them a taste as well of we must search every house, because look at all this gold we're finding. This is fantastic. So once Merlscheid is taken, Hazenven is taken, Then it gets a bit sketchy, because what I do know is that the 1st Battalion peeled off and they approached Lanzerath between the Backersberg, which I found out could possibly be a geographical feature on the right of the road, which I found reference to in an obscure Belgian cycling thing online. And between the Backersberg and the Landstrasse, so the road heading up. Now, if you look at the accepted narratives, that the Germans were seen entering Lanzerath, marching on either side of the road, you know, without a care in the world, rifles slung. You know, one account that they possibly heard them singing, that, you know, they were quite nonchalant in their approach to the village of Lanzerath. But I don't understand that, because they'd just seen heavy combat in Hulscheid and Merlscheid, some resistance in Hazenven, and why would they be so nonchalant entering Lanzerath? But then, you know, I wasn't there, so I can't say. And the 2nd Battalion, which is heading off to the southwest there, crosses the main road to Lanzerath. So we don't really know where the 2nd Battalion is going, but we do know that the 2nd Battalion had losses in Lanzerath. So I think they crossed the road and then headed up, skirting that geographical feature there. So they were on either side of the Landstrasse, heading towards Lanzerath. But the first type text there, underneath Halschlag, from midnight, a silent march on both sides of Scheid. Everything depended on the weather. It had to be cloudy, gloomy and foggy in order not to feel the enemy air superiority at the start of attack. So they were praying that it was going to be overcast, horrible weather to stop the Yabos from coming out, which it worked out as it happened. It worked out quite well, the weather. Yeah. The other account at the bottom, at 5:30 hours on the 16th, because we're all aware of this offensive artillery and Werfer barrage that occurred on that morning on the 05:30. This is Roppelt, so he's in the mortar platoon. We had to step aside for the assault troops. Everything was silent, no noise, no smoking. Suddenly a hell of a noise. Not 40 meters behind us, a Werfer battery opened up. Then came the V1 rockets, a jet of fire behind them. One flew up, dipped and exploded in the American lines. Almost all the artillery fired in unison. Then suddenly more than 100 searchlights shone their strong light off the clouds and back to earth, bathing the landscape in front of us in a ghostly daylight. Americans drove past us, German soldiers and American uniforms, which I thought was quite interesting. Whether he did actually see that or not, I don't know, but I thought it was quite interesting that he mentions that. So you could see that the pre-dawn, you know, once I don't think the artillery had even finished before they'd started marching over the frontier, but you can imagine these searchlights going on to light up the ground ahead of them so that they can see. And it must have been awful from the other point of view, looking across this no man's land and seeing these ghostly figures coming towards you in this milky, horrible daylight, artificial daylight. The other thing is that we talk about V1s because we forget that it wasn't just a Werfer and artillery barrage. V1s were also used as well. Heinz Fick refers to them as Eiffel Terror, because many of them didn't, if they were headed towards Antwerp or London, that they didn't reach their target because many of them fell in the Eiffel short of getting to the Channel. So they weren't just battling with the cold, with the enemy, their enemy, lice, because Heinz Fick mentions lice as well, which you really sort of connect to the Eastern Front and not to the Ardennes offensive. But they were also looking at these shortfalls in the V1 rockets that they were firing over, these new wonder weapons that they'd been told about, that this offensive is going to be easy because look what we got these brand new super weapons above us, but the damn things were falling short. In fact, let me read that a minute. That's from the 3rd of January. He stops writing a letter to his wife, Heinz Fick, and the reason I stopped writing just now, a V1 projectile stopped working near us and fell down, making a huge bang. We had been hearing their loud drone overhead at night and in the evenings. So they must have been firing them at quite a rate throughout the Ardennes offensive, whether it be the Americans or Antwerp or London, but quite a shower going over during those few weeks.
And by the way, well, just to interrupt you, you talked about, we're going to talk about them approaching the village of Lanzerath. Mike Smeets, who's watching, said, because he exchanged letters with some of the people you have as well. He said he has interviewed a Belgian eyewitness who did see the German paratroopers walking into Lanzerath in the mist. So he's saying a Belgian confirmed they were walking into town. So
did he say that they were walking on the road in sort of close formation, or did they come in from the field? That'd be interesting to know, whether they converged on the road or whether they were actually walking up the center of the road. That'd be interesting to know.
Well, he's heard that. I'm hoping he'll answer. So yeah. Let's keep on going. So let's move up. There's our objective. There's the village we're talking about. So
yeah. This Alex Kershaw has this in his book. You see it in a few different places, and the numbered areas there were added by Dick Byers, who was also a 371st Field Artillery observer, who was a friend of Arnold Weisenberg's as well. They'd corresponded together for a while. Now, Dick Byers wasn't in Lanzerath. He managed to escape from Buchholz the following morning when the Germans entered. But he sort of put the location points on this photograph. I haven't added them, but we're going to talk about them on the next slide, just to give you some perspective of how small this village is. It's fairly widespread. From the German point of view, it was 23 houses and a church, and that was Lanzerath, you know. But we'll see on the next slide. It just shows you up in the northwest, up in the north there. Sorry, Paul, if you just go back, it's numbers 1 and 2, which are in the top left corner. He's put down as the positions of the INR platoon. And now I don't know if that was taken long after the war, but as we'll see in the next slide, their positions were on the edge of the wood. This seems to be out in fairly open ground, as I can see it. So I don't know how reliable those positions are, but the next drawing, which was produced by Carlo Fernandez, who was a member of the INR platoon, he wasn't present on the 16th. He was in the rear, but he obviously put this together with the help of the survivor, you know, of the veterans in later years. But he's also put in which dugout the guys were, the INR platoon and the artillery observation platoon unit. But the interesting thing is he's put on there the terrain. He's written on the terrain. So approximately 200 yards to the closest house in Lanzerath, 25-30 degree slope from the edge of the wood, and that pasture that between them and the village is bisected by this 4-foot wire fence, barbed wire fence, which is quite important when it comes to the first assault by the Germans, because they've got to, for some reason, they decide on frontal assaults, going up that 20 to 30 degree slope in the open, wearing dark clothing because they haven't got snow clothes, and they have to climb over the fence to get there. So you can see what's going to happen. The next one, Paul.
Oh, and just to confirm, Mike is saying yes. The Belgian witness said they were on the road and they were in a line. That's what he's the Belgian.
Oh, right. Okay. So when we look at the slide in a minute, there could be an explanation for that maybe they just converged on the road when they were spotted. But from the German point of view, you know, they approached across country between the Backersberg and the road, so they may well have just converged, not come under any fire, and thought the town was deserted, because in all reality, it was at that point when they approached, it was deserted, apart from 2 men of the INR platoon who were in a house observing. Everyone else was up on the ridgeline. So the civilians are in their cellars. In this case, someone was out because they saw them. But yeah, that's interesting. So maybe the American account, you know, again, that differs, doesn't it, from the German one. So the photographs, I've broken my cardinal rule, Paul. I'm putting photographs of a battlefield location, and I haven't been there. But I'll explain why, because I didn't have the interest in it. I had no interest to go to Belgium. So I've used Street View. I spent hours on Street. Don't think I just downloaded them this afternoon. I've been studying them and other photographs. I even wrote to some tour guides who do Ardennes tours, and none of them would supply me with photographs. They said they didn't have any at Lanzerath, so I thought that's a bit odd. But anyway,
in defense of tour guides, Greg, because I am one. we go to the places, and often people ask me, have you got photos? I go, no, because I go there. I don't always take photos of places I go to. It's one of the things. The amount of times I've gone back to somewhere and something I used to point out has gone away. You know, a wall's been taken down, a tree's fallen over. And I think to myself, why didn't I take a photo of that when it was there? So in defense of tour guides, we don't always take photos of the places we go to regularly. So there we are. I'll get that out of the way.
Okay, I accept your apology on behalf of tour guides. The top left photograph. So from the main road, I don't know how much the main road has changed over the years. I don't think it has, to be honest, because a lot of the houses in the aerial photograph are still there. There's a lot of additions in the village, as far as I can see. But from the main road to the memorial, so they've got a memorial up near the tree line, and you can, it sort of highlights that that slope, the open pasture. I don't think that same fence is there, the wire fence, but you can see the distance involved between the road where the paratroopers would have been, the 9th Regiment would have been, or elements of the 9th Regiment would have been, and where the INR platoon defences were. The next one to the right of it, from the road looking southeast. So I can't say what the visibility was like, but on this particular day, you can look right down to the southeast towards Merlshide and Hullshide and possibly over to Lossheim. So there are accounts where they could see German troop movements coming over, from the Lossheim area, but the others, the weather conditions, gloomy and hazy, you don't know what they could have seen that day. The bottom left from the last three houses, and that we'll talk about an incident that happened at the last three houses that led to the opening of the firefight. But there are buildings there now. There's another house on the left side of the road where there wasn't 77 years ago today. And then from the memorial, the last photograph, bottom right, gives a better view from where, almost at these defensive positions, looking down to the southeast towards the village. So that's the sort of view that you would have seen from either one or two of the dugouts, these well camouflaged, produced dugouts. So you can see it's quite a way down to the village from the dugout position. And the next one, the top left, the all-important road junction. On the left there, 1.5 kilometres up the road is the Buchholz station, the Buchholz area, and following up there around to the right is Lossheimer Graben. But of course, that was denied. The Panzers were denied that route because the bridge was out over the railway cutting. So that's why they had to come round the long way into Lanzerath, which then resulted in this altercation and the movement in the early hours on riding on top of the tanks. And then you got the railway cutting, the former railway cutting. I don't know anything about when the railway was taken out, but it looks like a footpath now these days. If I'd been there, Paul, I'd be able to tell you, but I haven't. I'm sorry, everybody, I've been there. The railway cutting. So 3 of Lieutenant Bouck's men got waylaid. They were supposed to enter the village to assist the 2 guys that were in the observation post after the artillery barrage had finished. But they saw the Germans and they ended up getting waylaid. They took another route up to the northeast, ended up in the woods, and they ended up this far up to the northeast, crossed the railway cutting, and the other side they came into an engagement with men of the Fusilier Regiment 27, 12 Volksgrenadier, and they were captured. So Bouck, before the paratroopers, before this firefight started, he was down 3 men because they were captured up to the northeast. So that's the photographs that I took on my visit to Belgium. Sorry, my non-visit to Belgium. This photograph I only found on the internet a few days ago. It was on eBay. It's a photograph for sale, allegedly signed by Lyle Bouck himself. But I put it on there because it just sort of highlights better than the photographs what the conditions may have been like at that time. This snowy forest area. And from Eisenhower's Bitter Woods, I've just put there just to describe the weather at the time. A heavy layer of snow covered the ground and the weather was damp and cold. There you go. 77 years ago today in Lanzerath. I don't actually know if Lyle Bouck is in that photograph. I wouldn't have thought so, so I don't know why he signed it. Maybe because it's just a snowy Belgian winter photograph. Yeah. That somebody sent to him. Right, so now we get into the crux of the battle, and it's very difficult to piece together. And you can see the guy who made the comment about coming on the road, seen coming up on the road. Yeah, they may well have done. He's right, they could have. And I've probably put this divergence in, too late. Perhaps they had come in a little bit more to the southeast and then came up the main road thinking that the place was abandoned. There's no official after action report. There's no KTB, so we can't rely on that. So sort of just trying to piece this together, best we can from the sources we got. So first and second company, I know from the text that the first and second company were the spearhead of this. And if you read some of the American accounts, they say that a certain amount of men had passed before the firefight, that Lyle Bout wanted to allow a certain amount of men to pass before he opened fire. The third company I know was in the left side of the town from the text. So I've put them in on the left side of the village. And we know that for certain because of an event that happened in the left side of the village that involved the third company. The second battalion, don't know. To be honest, I just don't know. I know that they were in Lanzerath because they suffered losses in Lanzerath, in the village itself. So I think they were just further to the east and took part in these frontal assaults from the southwest there, or from the south, and suffered casualties. The blue one, the fourth company, was a complete mystery to me. But then I found losses in Holzheim, and Holzheim is 3 kilometers to the west. So I believe that the fourth company, because they didn't suffer any losses in Lanzerath, moved possibly in an outflank maneuver to get to Buchholz or to recce out Buchholz up to the northwest. I don't know, but they had losses in Holzheim, which is 3 kilometers further to the west. All right, and we'll come on to losses in a minute.
Yeah,
I've transposed some of the locations identified by Dick Byers on here, and the top one, Teen Scholzen. The name Teen Scholzen to me only appears in the book about Lossheimergraben. Lyle Bout and his men observed this, the Fallschirmjäger coming up the road. Suddenly in front of him, on the road, a couple hundred yards in front, he saw 3 officers hold an O group in the middle of the road. So who they were, we don't know, but I would assume it was the battalion commander, Heinz Fick, perhaps, and the first company commander, Captain Schiffke. And I know it must be Captain Schiffke because he was one of the first casualties when the firing started. He had a grazing shot to his arm when the firing opened. Just as they were about to open fire on this nice 3-officer O group standing in the road looking at maps, this little girl, and this features in most accounts, the little girl, you probably heard about it as well, come out.
People have already been asking, is there going to be anything new from Greg about the little girl in the road? So we'll find out, won't we?
Oh, we won't. There isn't anything new.
Okay.
But it's just when she comes out and she points, everyone knows the story. She points and it looks like she's pointing in the direction of the American positions, and then the firefight begins. What I was going to say, if anyone else had heard the story years after the war, when this lady was tracked down, I don't know if this can be confined to the dip bin or what, and she was asked as an adult if what had been her intention that day, and she was merely pointing out the direction of the Americans had gone because they had abandoned the town. Once the barrage had lifted, the men of the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion hitched their guns up and they disappeared up to the north. And hot on their heels was the guys from the 371st, but they didn't continue to Buchholz. They came around the back and joined Bauck and his men. So from a little girl's point of view, who had got used to having Americans in the village, and then suddenly they're hightailing it out, she's probably, where are the Americans? Well, they've gone that way, and maybe not grassing the INR platoon up in their position if she had seen them at all, Oh, and the other thing, Paul, I don't know if anyone's ever explored the fact that did the Germans utilize civilians in this area, which had been German, but before the Treaty of Versailles, as a spy network, because, for example, the Longest Winter mentions 2 incidents where on one occasion the 371st had sent a guy back to the rear for questioning because he was acting suspiciously in the village. And when the 2 guys, Sergeant Slate and Private Krieger, took up an observation position, which is marked up on that map there, the INR OP, they found a civilian on the phone looking out the window. So I just wondered if, when the Germans withdrew, did they, take on people who were patriotic to Germany to relay information to them if they had
that came up interesting. I got an email after yesterday's show about the Wereth 11 about the fact, did the Germans have spies, because that part of Belgium in Germany, and the speculation from the email I got was that because the offensive was put together so quickly, there'd have been no time to get communication, to get info. You'd have had to have sent the message to the spies saying, find out this. Then the spies would have had to send it back to the German. It's too short a time frame to get any information back in real time. And that's kind of, it made sense to me. If you plan this operation 3 months in advance, maybe. But with the speed they put it together. But just to add, Mike Smeets, who's the guy who sort of spoke to the Belgians, but he said you're correct about the little girl. Probably I think he means about the pointing to the Americans having left. And he also says, referring to your map there, he says the German paras took the road near the Arrow Cafe Palm and attacked from there to the west to have a little cover. So he says where you've put the arrow saying Cafe Palm, that's where they attacked from. So there we are. That's
right. Okay. Because it's good that he's he's had these Belgian interviews, because that gives a completely different perspective on it. I wish I'd had that sort of exposure to that. But like I said, I know that these arrows aren't correct. But we do know that from the village, whether it be the centre or the northern part, they did attack up to the northwest towards the position. But going back to Tina Schultz, my point was about, she's seen the Americans leave and things like that. But that book, the Steve Rudieski book, is the first time where she was named. It was always just a little girl, but Teen Scholzen is obviously the daughter of the chap that owned the Cafe Scholzen, for example, but down in the village. But anyway, we digress. And I've just put there that between the arrows, the sort of time frame of these assaults from various sources, not German sources. German sources don't mention anything more than that an assault took place on the defensive positions, whereas the American sources, you can put together a sort of time frame. For example, there's a ceasefire at about 1:45, but the Germans don't mention anything about a ceasefire. They don't mention the afternoon attack. They just mention, and this is from Vince Kuhlbach, who was the one who pleaded with the officers, I don't know if he pleaded or not, to outflank, which is something that should have happened earlier in the day. But then Vince Kuhlbach led a platoon to outflank them from the west, which come to in a minute. We'll come to that in a minute, Paul.
Yeah, no problem.
Right, the next slide, Paul. The frontal assaults. Oberst von Hoffmann may have excelled in dogfights, but he had no infantry combat experience. From Roppout. This wasn't just aimed at him; it's actually aimed at Oberst Erdmann as well, who went on to command the 7th Division. But I thought he's irrelevant in this. So I've read but I can't remember the source, that Lyle Bauk was under the impression that Fallschirmjäger were tactical experts. He recognized them as being paratroopers from those that were wearing paratrooper uniforms, and he was completely surprised when the first assault was carried out. Someone's we'll come into that. Mike Smeets, we'll come into that in a minute. Cafe Scholzen. If you see me say Cafe Palm Scholzen, you'll know why. Okay.
Right.
So we've got all these officers in the 9th Regiment, and out of the battalion commanders, the 3 battalion commanders, you've got 1 who's got combat experience and 2 that haven't. So 1st and 2nd battalion commanders don't have any real combat experience. And then out of the company commanders, 8 out of 15 had combat experience in Normandy, but as a lower rank, you know, a platoon or a company command, Normandy and Holland. So you can see the level of experience has dropped a lot since Normandy because of the losses they've suffered along the way. But as I said, you know, though not all of those officers would have been terrible officers at leading men, because they still had the leadership qualities and the man management, and they had a little bit of training. And so we can't say that they were all terrible. But the frontal assaults, it just seems odd why and who ordered it straight away. You know, the first assault, frontal assault, up a pasture, 20 to 30 degree slope, crossing a 4-foot wire fence against well dug in, well developed positions with no snow, camouflage uniforms. You know, you just stand out like a sore thumb and easy targets. And that would probably explain why there were so many headshot kills. That
except in defense, Greg, let's look at the overall objectives of the offensive. Is, you know, Peter Caddick Adams outlined that the speed is of paramount importance. They have a, you know, the whole you know, the Sixth Army hasn't got the fuel for a long campaign. So I suppose the message being sent down is quick, and frontal assaults can be very successful if there isn't a well dug in enemy ahead of you. And this is where we come back to the overall lack of intelligence and reconnaissance the Germans have in this battle. In that, by this point in the war, we allies, we have aerial photos, we have this, we have that, we have ultra. The Germans are going into this blind, and had there not been a well dug in platoon on that hill, they could have gone 5 miles in a couple of hours. We're talking about this with the benefit of hindsight to some extent. So full frontal assaults are working elsewhere on that same day, aren't they? Let's be honest. That is a tactic the Germans are using successfully in other parts of the battle at this very moment, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you'd think after the first losses that to send another wave out, or send 3 or 4 waves out during a day without, you know, it wasn't until the sun started to go down, or you know the light started to fade, that it was decided we're outflanked them. Now, whether they thought they were, you know, we're well behind our time frame now, we've got to end this. And not bothered about the sacrifices that have been made during the day carrying out frontal assaults, because they did know they had a job to do. They had to move past Lanzerath. Unfortunately, they didn't until the following day. But yeah, the frontal assaults, and we go to Vince Callback then on the next slide, because he said in the afternoon, after suffering about 36 men on the hill. So after these, he doesn't mention about these successive waves, but he does mention suffering 36 men on the hill. Callback with his platoon and 2 more platoons from the 1st Company started from the Adolf Schur house up the hill to the back of the foxholes on the hill just before dark. So he just pretty much confirms that, you know, that event happened, and that was the event that led to these dugouts being overrun one at a time, and the guys being captured in their serious and minor injured state. And the battle had sort of ended at that point. And the men were brought back down to the village. But I just want to read out a letter written on the 23rd of December, or part of a letter from Heinz Fick, because obviously it goes quiet. His letters go quiet from the 6th. He's not going to say anything about the offensive, or nor does he get the time to do it.
Yeah.
So on this particular day, which is the 23rd, 2 days to Christmas, we are facing the enemy at 1 kilometer distance east of Malmedy. We began the offensive on the 12th of December. My company was at the forefront of the battalion. I have lived through extraordinary moments. It would be too much to describe my experiences to you in detail. May the Almighty arrange for me to tell them to you and my parents in person one day. After we had fought to clear the streets, the next day our strong armoured tanks came, which have already penetrated far into the enemy lines. We still have combat with enemy forces hiding out in villages and wooded areas. This is why we have to keep on the attack, hampered by enemy mortars and their artillery. The casualties in my company are high, but we have to beat the enemy with our remaining strength. May the Almighty grant us a decisive success and an enemy willing to make peace. We obtain large plunder of cigarettes, canned goods, and vehicles, etc. So that was, you know, a week after the offensive began, was his first opportunity to write. So you can see how busy they were in those first few days. So that's Heinz Fick's company commander, 2nd Company, 9th Regiment. Then, Paul, I just want to touch on the sanitator, the medics.
Yep.
Because a lot of the accounts talk about medics being shot, and you can see in that when Dr. Fraser approached Arnold Weisenberg for veterans to come forward for his book, Hold at All Costs, none of them wanted to speak to him. And this is why. We know about a dozen veterans of the 9th Regiment in our comradeship, but none of them will talk with anybody, especially Americans, because of the killing of medics on the 16th of December, 1944. So I sort of revisited this, and they were really bitter about it. Now, as far as I can make out, only 2 medics were killed in Lanzerath on the 16th, but from the German side, it sounds like there were lots of them killed. As they went out to 10, they were being shot. Most of them headshots. And there's, which one is it? Oh, yes, it's one of the INR platoon saw a medic tend to someone he thought was dead because he'd shot him. There was no movement from the guy on the ground. The medic came out, and it appeared that he might have been talking into some sort of device, a comms device, whatever, captured walkie-talkie, who knows, and possibly calling in mortar fire, because some mortar fire came in from the 13th Company further south. And he was also wearing a holstered pistol, or he had a holster on his belt. So the guy in the chap in the IR platoon shot him, and he went down. And I thought, well, yeah, I can see his point of view, because at that point of the war, if I'm not mistaken, medics were supposed to be unarmed. But I also read, I think the rules on that has changed after the war, that they can have a sidearm for the defense of themselves and their casualties. But it wasn't the case in the war. But I did read that American medics routinely carried small arms in the Pacific, in the Far East, to defend themselves, because they had occasions where the Japanese had paid no court, to.
Yeah, and in the ETO, I know a number of medics, American medics, who carried pistols for defense, because of aid stations being overrun, and because of stories that they carried pistols. It's not supposed to happen, but it
was routinely done. Yeah, and I know Fallschirmjäger medics who appear in my book who were routinely armed in Russia, because they'd come across instances where medics had been killed and wounded had been killed, so they just had the weapon for the defense of themselves so I think this whole thing about the medics being killed has been blown out of proportion a little bit by the German side, this time, because I can only find 2 from the texts that were killed that day, both of them from the 3rd Company. One who was killed earlier in Hergesberg, the only casualty I can find in Hergesberg, but his name's mixed up. The German account is a little bit mixed up. They've named him, but he was killed earlier in the morning. But also in Roppelt, there were 13 cases where medics who were marked, because those guys that were killed had 5 red crosses on them, including a Red Cross flag. So they were well marked. It wasn't as if they just had a small armband.
Yeah. Well
marked. So 13 were killed by small arms fire, and 3 other cases killed by aircraft, strafing and hitting the troop dressing station, the main dressing stations. So they did suffer a lot of medic loss, and all sides did. Medics get killed accidentally or on purpose. But in the case of Lanzerath on the 16th of December, I can only find evidence of 2 being killed. But as it said above, they were still really bitter about it. And I think this is one of the reasons why Dr. Fraser scrubbed his book in the end, because when he planned his trip to Germany to interview these guys, there was 3 of them that had been arranged to meet with. Vince Kuhlbach, who gladly spoke to him, but Vince's story had been published in many places anyway before, within the Kameradschaft and things like that. Sepp Reiner and Leo Becker. Leo Becker went in the hospital, and Sepp Reiner changed his mind. Dr. Fraser had planned to go to Austria to visit him, and he changed his mind last minute. So I don't want to talk to him. So I think he scrubbed his book because he couldn't get enough input from the German point of view. And that's why it became the book that never was, because it was one-sided. He wanted to tell both sides, but couldn't get the German perspective, because he only had one man who was willing to speak to him. And that was because they were still very bitter about the killing of the medics on the 16th of December.
And just the fact, without going down a rabbit hole, the fact that there's you're suggesting that the Fallschirmjäger veterans were bitter about the death of their medics. It reminds us that participants in a battle view it very much from their point of view. And we did the show yesterday about the Wehrerth 11 and talked about the tragic murder by probably SS reconnaissance units of the 11 African Americans, and we see that as a vile act. And yet somewhere on the battlefield, essentially a few miles away, there are German veterans bitter about their medics being killed. And the fact you read the letter of the guy asking for help from the Almighty, the belief they had that God was on their side. It just reminds us that we all need to understand that these events are seen through the eyes of people who sometimes think they are on the side of the righteous, and that the others, the enemy are the enemy are the baddies. It's the Mitchell and Webb sketch. Are we the baddies? These Fallschirmjäger don't see of themselves as being the baddies, do they? They're fighting as a unit, and if they feel their medics are being killed, they're aggrieved at that. And it's a real reminder that there's different views of the same event.
And of course, when Heinz Fick says about his belief in peace, that that again, was that his own personal view, or was that something that they all believed in, that if they succeeded in this, that there would be peace?
They could bring peace quicker by getting a successful outcome here. They could sue for peace. Everybody goes home before Christmas, and it's fascinating that there's these different points of view. But we you read this one, didn't you? I think no,
I didn't read this one, because this, I believe, 99.9% sure, is by Dr. Fraser.
Right.
Because I've not read it anywhere else. So I think because Dr. Fraser used to send snippets to Arnold to keep him interested, to motivate him to sort of get the veterans to speak to him. So that, for example, the synopsis at the beginning, and there's a few other bits in this one. And this is Peter Gacke, who was one of the 4 artillery observers from the 371st Field Artillery. And this leads on to what I'm going to talk about next, which is probably the highlight of the presentation, to be honest, if I'm honest, Paul. It's just his account of that first thing, but it's basically the last bit that I'm interested. We were awakened by an artillery barrage early in the morning of the 16th of December. We were in contact with the battery, and I don't remember what our orders were, but when we began to get ready to leave, we found that the tank destroyer company had already left town, which we know about. They disappeared up to the north towards Buchholz. While I was loading the Jeep, I was singing a part of O Tannenbaum. I seem to recall a woman made some remark about my singing. Guess it was strange considering the circumstances, but we didn't feel any sense of urgency at that time. We left some food and a package that I received from home. As far as I know now, we were the last to leave town. We started back to the battery and then stopped to help the INR platoon. I guess we stayed too long. Before night, we were captured by the German paratroopers. So I put that in because he believed he was the last to leave town. Once the tank destroyer guys had left and they were packing up the Jeep to leave themselves, that there were no other American forces in Lanzerath. That was it, all gone, finished. They went up and joined the INR platoon up in the northwest on the ridgeline positions. And that was it. Let's see what happens next. Okay? So that leads me on to the church and farmhouse. Now, I read this again a few months, the German perspective, and I read it again a few weeks ago. Then I got in touch with Niels Henkemans for him to read through it as well, to read the original text, the German text, and see if I'm not going mad as to whether this incident happened in Lanzerath or whether it happened in another village. And I sent it to him. He read through it and he goes, Greg, yes, this happened. Thanks, Niels, for confirming that. This did happen. And it was also confirmed in a letter by Arnold Weisenberg about this incident. So I thought, right, cheers, Niels, I'm not going mad. This did happen in Lanzerath, but so why haven't I read about it in any other book? So what we have is this firefight that occurs in the church and farmhouse there, you can see on the aerial photograph. And I believe it's the farm just to the left, if that is a farm, or it could be a farm up to the northwest there. But the church I've been fixated on And you'll see in a minute how this could have been quite controversial, because you've seen the presentation. And this position, if you look on Google Maps, as the crow flies, with almost clear visibility from the defensive positions, or part of the defensive positions, only 500 meters. So I know that we didn't have continuous firing all that day, as far as I can make out. It wasn't continuous machine gun fire. And I'm just wondering if those men on the ridgeline witnessed or heard anything coming from these positions 500 meters away. So if we move on, Paul, this is Frubizer. This is the part that I had to get Niels to confirm that I wasn't going mad. So now the platoon of Senior Sergeant Heine Hansen attacks. Next to him is the platoon of the old fighting Oberfeldwebel Hans Zalikowski. Heavy hand-to-hand combat occurs at the farmhouse. The attacking groups of Sergeant Schmidt, Lange, and Mansion are taken under heavy fire. The strongest fire comes from the little church. A large group of Americans must have holed up there. Here, bullets hiss from a small window next to the door. Shooting from the hip, arrows go forward towards the church. So, Oberjäger Hodel succeeds in hanging 2 American explosive mines, which look like a Feldflash or water bottle, on the door handle of the church. The door flies into the church with a loud bang. A few stick grenades are quickly thrown into the church. More bangs, loud screams can be heard. Suddenly, an altar cloth is hanging out of the window. The Americans want to surrender. Someone calls out to them in English to come out one by one and without weapons. First, a young lieutenant marches out, then another 14 men follow at intervals. The battle for Lanzerath has thus come to an end. And this is during the afternoon. This is after midday, during the afternoon, this incident occurs. And of course, I'm reading this again after I've just read Longest Winter, and now I'm in what's going on? I don't know. This has been confirmed. 2 of us have confirmed, and Arnold has confirmed, that this is in Lanzerath, in the church in Lanzerath, which is moved position now. It's 1950. It was rebuilt in another position in the village. So I thought, then I'm reading through the letters again, and I come across this, and I'm in a complete, mess then. And now this is from Arnold, and now I hear the last words of Sergeant Bill Slate, the platoon sergeant. He was the INR platoon sergeant, this experienced guy who went on to serve in the US Army for years after the war. I'm telling you, for the last time, Lyle Bout was not there. And this is actually in the last letter that I received from Arnold. So, well, I've just read The Longest Winter. How would Arnold Weisenberg know what the last words of William Slate would be? But so did this come from Dr. Fraser? Did this outrageous snippet come from Dr. Fraser? Because I can't understand where else it would come from. And then underneath that, Arnold writes, that means that Bout was not in one of the foxholes when the Powers tried to storm the hill. Where was he? If you take a look in Frubizer, you'll find that Bout was in one of the houses where his men slept during the icy cold nights. From there, they shot some Powers, including medical orderlies carrying the Red Cross. Bout and 12 of his men were captured in this house by the 2 platoons of Sergeant Heinrich Hansen and Zalikowski. So he's either getting that confused with house and church. On the hill, there were only the following GIs: Lieutenant Springer and his 3 men, one of them dead, Sergeant Slate, and Private First Class Milosevic. They were captured before nightfall by a platoon under Vince Kulbach, a friend of mine from Lomar. So I'm now thinking, well, somebody's got this wrong here somewhere, and I don't think it's the accepted narrative. So you could see my point of view, can you? If I've read this over a period of years before I'd read, and I've revisited it after or during I'm reading The Longest Winter, and I'm thinking, well, what if this had actually been published? What if somebody had actually believed this and published it? It's rewriting the history. It's calling men liars who have testified before Congress. So I thought, well, this is wrong. It is wrong. So I thought, well, it's got to be a more simpler answer to this. Why it's happened? And I just think that Arnold Weisenberg's got it completely wrong. Wherever he got that snippet from, Sergeant Slate's last words is completely wrong. And the men that were in the church, the young lieutenant wasn't Larbauk, and the men that surrendered with him weren't the INR platoon. it was probably stragglers from the south, from 14th Cavalry Group or whatever, who had made their way north, heard the sound of firing, wanted to hole up, and ended up in a firefight with the 3rd Company, who were in the left side of the town. So that's obviously, there's been some sort of mixture. But I just thought to myself, what if that had been published? It would have caused a real storm of controversy, calling all these men liars and things like that. So I thought that'd be quite interesting to bring up, because it's not featured anywhere. There is no text saying, oh yeah, by the way, there were other Americans in Lanzerath at that time in this separate firefight down in the west side of the village. You know, so it's quite interesting where these new bits of information pop up.
And Mike Smeets, who is who earlier talked about the Belgian civilian he interviewed, he said, confusing, isn't it? Wesenberg also repeated that to me. So yeah,
all right.
I mean, so yeah, it's one of those situations, isn't it, where if you want to believe something sort of scandalous has happened, you have to make some kind of mental leaps, don't you? But I always go with my Occam's razor theory of the most likely outcome is the ordinary one, and the ordinary one was up on the foxholes. That's where he's rendered, and this is, I would say, is almost certainly another lieutenant from another unit. To try and connect this and unravel a story that people have testified in front of Congress is a big claim, isn't it? It's a big statement.
Yeah, massive, and yeah. So I came to my own conclusion within minutes, of having seen both perspectives. Then, it wasn't that difficult to come to conclusion, but it would just be interesting to find out who they were. Who they were with, where they had come from, because that episode is not mentioned anywhere else, which I find quite strange. But a lot of strange things happened on the 16th of December, 77 years ago, didn't it? So,
yeah. And when we talked at the beginning, Greg, about the books when they were written, and I said to you before you went live, often it's the first book you read about something that is the one that shapes all your thinking, because you can't unshake that first version. If this version, Wesenberg's version, had become the first one we'd heard, maybe that would have been the one to prove wrong. And it's that kind of the first one sort of sets the benchmark, doesn't it? And this is this thing we're at now. The people who are watching this, who are Battlefield guys like Colin Taylor's watching, and Ben Main did start watching, was going to go back and watch it at the beginning, is you start unraveling these stories and picking them apart. And you do come to these little crossroads of, well, hang on, that conflicts with that, and then you realize you're kind of, it's like that when you snag your winter jumper on a nail and it starts unraveling, and you watch the jumper just disappear to a ball of wool. It can easily happen with these stories. You sort of pick at it, don't you? And then the thing starts unraveling around you. It's amazing. It's amazing where we are with this kind of history now.
It's interesting that other chap was just mentioned. Was he called Mike? Is it Michael Pete? I can't see.
Mike Smeets. Yeah.
Mike's that he's been told that as well. That's quite interesting. That it wasn't just me. Then it was somebody else, and obviously others. But maybe Mike had already read The Longest Winter and The Bitter Woods and things, so he actually knew. Whereas I didn't. I did it back to front. But anyway, I thought I'd throw that in there just in case of. Somebody was interested.
Yeah, no, right. we're definitely interested, Greg. So, but the bit that I'm really looking forward to it. Well, I'm looking forward to all the presentation. But this is the loss card. So this is when we're going to talk about the German losses, the statistics, what we can say from these German side of things. So run us through, for those who don't know what loss cards are. Take us through the next few slides.
Right, so the loss cards are available on subscription from Fold 3 and from, oh my God, what's the genealogy website? I'm paying them £20 a month, I can't remember.
Ancestry.
So Ancestry, yes. The price differs in different countries, £20 a month in the UK for access to their archive. The BA have allowed them to utilise this archive of loss cards. Now, I've been using them for a year or more. I've been through thousands of them for Battle of Crete, lots of other places, Leros, places like that. And they build a good picture. They're fantastic resource. But unfortunately, like Normandy, for example, there's a black hole. In the summer of 1944, it appears to be a black hole because they probably don't have the time to stop and fill these in for each death. So they're very few and far between, particularly for Fallschirmjäger massive black hole for 6th Regiment. I can't find anything. And then I was surprised when I started this. I just typed in the name of the only officer that was killed that day in Lanzerath. It was a captain, Heinrich Thietz from the 6th Company, and it came up. And I thought, whoa, hang on a minute, well, who else? So I had the list from all the sources, from Roppelt and Frubeiser, and I ran through all of the named losses, and I came up with 28 loss cards. And the loss cards are revolutionary with research because they not only contain the full name, the proper, or sometimes the proper spelling of the name, where they were born, their rank, the service number, where they were killed, when they were killed, how they were killed, not all the time, but most of them. Sometimes even the time of when they were killed. And on the reverse, you've also got next of kin and also the location of the field grave. So they're quite informative cards. The two we got up there at the moment are two of the men killed at Lanzerath. Karl Quatuor, I can't get the spelling right, Quat, 2 U's in it, I'm gone, from the 2nd Company, from Heinz Fick's company, was probably one of the first guys killed in the first assault. 2nd Company made an assault on the ridgeline, and Quatuor was killed, and killed by headshot. A lot of headshots occurred, and we'll go through statistics in a minute. The guy underneath, 3rd Company, in the west of the town, or further left in the town, not west of the town, he was also killed. Now this is the guy who was killed, and from the German perspective, a medic ran out to him, and he cried out headshot, that Karl Schiel had been killed by headshot, and the medic was killed. And the 2nd medic came out and he was killed as well. That's from the German perspective. But if you look at Karl Schiel's loss card, he was killed by mortar fragments to the stomach and chest. So he wasn't killed by headshot. So that claim that he'd been killed by headshot, or, you know, his head was fine. He was killed by fragments to the stomach and chest, which then got me thinking that they did receive some mortar support during the day, sporadic mortar support. So was this a friendly fire incident? Did a round fall short while they were carrying out an assault further left of their positions, and he was killed by fragments from one of their own mortars? I don't know. But the fact that it from the official, the German side, not the official, from the German perspective, he was killed by headshot, but his loss card puts it down as stomach and chest mortar fragments, which I thought was quite interesting.
Very.
Then the next one, Paul, the next slide. Like I said earlier in the show, that by plotting, we're going back to like GIS with Dr. Phil now. These fantastic graphics about. So you could see out of the 28 loss cards. So this is for the whole of the 9th Regiment that I can find, 28. You could see as they progress along from Scheid, Hergersberg, Hulscheid, Merlscheid, and Lanzerath, that the losses as they go. The 2 in Scheid, this is unusual because they were both killed by mortar fire. So this could have been like, how would you call it? If you'd heard and seen stuff and you just fired off a few rounds, you just fired in that general direction, and they got lucky, you know, because that was the start point early in the morning when they started to advance towards the Belgian frontier. Perhaps the Americans had lobbed a few mortars in that direction, and it just so happened that they killed a couple of German paratroopers on their way, all that way further east to Scheid. We get to Hergersberg, that's where one of the medics was killed. He was killed by a shot through the lung. So that was either a wild shot that hit him with, fatefully hit him, or whether it was through resistance that they'd come across in Hergersberg. Then the biggest losses, so I'm assuming there's obviously more losses than the 5 and 6 you see in Hulscheid and Merlscheid, but they're the ones that are recorded. And the ones in Hulscheid, for example, they're the 5 members that I've got records of. They're the 5 members of the 15th Company who were in a house that was hit by mortar, and they were all killed in the house. And in Merlscheid, which is 15th Company, so the regimental units were in Merlscheid, as well as the first battalion. The first battalion losses, but most of them are headshots, killed by headshots in Hurlshide. And then further to the west, you could see the Holzheim 3, I call them, because they were all from the 4th Company. And I said earlier that I'm sure that the 4th Company must have made this outflank maneuver, because further up to the north from Holzheim, in between those forests, is Buchholz. So that was one of their objectives to take. So perhaps they had been sent west, got to Holzheim, got into a firefight, and the men were killed. In fact, they were killed. 2 of them were killed by artillery, direct hits artillery, and 1 by a headshot. So, I just don't know why 4th Company members were killed in Holzheim, 3 kilometers to the southwest. And it's confirmed on their loss card because they're buried in Holzheim. They're field in Holzheim. And then we get to Lanzerath. You can see that the majority of the dead are in Lanzerath itself during that day, during these frontal assaults, during those daylight hours till just before dark. We got 11 losses that are recorded anyway, and again they're a mixture of 1st and 2nd Battalion, so it proves that the 2nd Battalion were in Lanzerath. They hadn't disappeared off to the west. They were in the vicinity of Lanzerath during the day, so both battalions were there. The 3rd was in reserve, and they suffered a lot of losses. And if we go to the statistic, oh, sorry, Paul, can we go back to the map one?
Yeah.
So we the 1st Battalion, these are recorded by Fruhbeiser. The 1st Battalion losses: 16 killed, 63 wounded, 13 missing. And the total for the 9th Regiment for the 16th was 37. That's according to Fruhbeiser mind. So that you've got a bit of give and take there. It could have been more. But when you read some accounts from the American perspective, or whoever's written it, sometimes it sounds like the bodies were piled up in that pasture, that there were hundreds of dead and things like that. So the Fruhbeiser's either playing it down, or that the losses were considerably lower. And like I said, I can only find 28 loss cards, but it still gives a good indication that quite a few guys were killed in Lanzerath during those assaults. So the next slide, Paul. Sorry, I keep saying next. And you've colorized that. I'm glad you can, because I could not get the color onto my.
I had to, so we could see it, because it wouldn't show up on screen. So I put a bit of color in it. So hopefully it works well. Yeah,
cheers for that. I appreciate it. And you can see I've done location and cause of death. So the out of the 28 loss cards, you can see that the most number of losses were in Lanzerath, because they were there for longer, involved in this firefight for most of the day, until just before dark. And cause of death at the bottom, where headshot is the overriding cause of death amongst the 9th Regiment during that day. So you get some good statistics. And I know from the longest winter that in the section about the I&R platoon coming together, they were all these young, fit, intelligent guys. They all had pretty good IQs, and they were also very good shots. They were also good marksmen. And when you've got paratroopers advancing on your position over open ground who aren't wearing snow camouflage, standing out in the snow, and these guys have got the time to line up on these advancing troops and take a good, well-aimed shot, because not only they've got the time as they're advancing, having to cross this fence to this pasture, but because they're good marksmen as well. Do you know what I mean? From these well-developed positions. So headshot, the biggest cause of death on the 16th.
And also the simple fact that the Germans are advancing towards them. You're not, if there's German enemy moving across your front, you're like in a shooting gallery of ducks. You've got to move your weapon across. They're coming towards you. I can imagine these I&R platoon are hardly having to move their rifles left and right. They're just waiting almost for the Germans to walk into their line of sight, and then bang, as you say there, with the snow on the ground, you're silhouetted there. It's kind of it's a perfect storm to give the Americans that advantage in that situation. Yeah,
well, even Alex Kershaw in his book, he says about the defenders up in the defensive positions were sort of aghast at these young lads just walking up aimlessly towards them, and they're just shooting, just killing these youngsters, and they keep coming. They keep coming. It's such a waste. So And there's a little bit there as well, Rob, out about on the next slide, Paul, about the Lanzerath graves, because I thought this was quite interesting. On the 17th, so the day after the fighting, which obviously shows that there were some men who stayed behind in the Lanzerath area, maybe even to collect bodies and get rid of them, put them in the ground. According to E. Palm, who was obviously the son of the person who owned the Cafe Palm, Cafe Sheldon, who was 16-year-old old at the time. The mass grave opposite the Cafe Palm also already held 30 to 40 Fallschirmjäger and GIs of the 99th Infantry Division. So maybe, others, 99th Infantry Division, who were just a little bit further to the north, outside of the INR, where the INR platoon were, perhaps they were brought into Lanzerath to be buried in this one grave. And I know that there was a field grave in there in the village itself, because Heinrich Thietz, who was the only officer to be killed on the 16th, is buried in the schoolyard, in a field grave in the schoolyard in Lanzerath, wherever that was in the village. All of the dead were buried in a Zeltplan, a tent quarter. A little girl, a 2.5-year-old girl called Gertrude Christen, asked her mother standing at the grave, are they German Americans? Because she'd seen them being buried side by side in this field grave. So I thought I'd put that. That's quite interesting. The next, because we're talking about losses, the name Billy Queen has been part of my lexicon for years. If anybody says Billy or Queen, I instantly think about Billy Queen. He was the only American loss that day on the 16th. There were some very seriously injured men, wounded men, but Billy Queen was killed. And I've put it on there because there was some controversy about his death. That some sources say that he was shot running away from the dugout. He was shot in the back, giving him almost like this cowardly type action. And then some of his comrades, no, he was at the time he was shot, he stood up, he was firing his weapon, he was standing up to see where his shot was falling, out of the dugout. So it just goes to show that, one account versus the other. But Arnold Weserberg mentioned him in one of his letters. He put, but why was Billy Queen of Crum, West Virginia killed? He was shooting at the Paras with his heavy machine gun. Now, I don't know if he was firing a heavy machine gun at the time. One of our men saw the discharge flame and fired at him, hiding in a well-camouflaged bunker with Joe McConnell of Tempe, Arizona, and James Fort of Florida. McConnell still living, talks about it. And I think, according to that drawing by Carlos Fernandez, that they were actually in the trench with him. So they're best placed to say how he was killed. But I thought that was quite interesting, because he was the only, miraculously, he was the only loss. And Peter Gacke, who was the sergeant of the 371st Observation Teams, said that Billy Queen would have been better suited somewhere where he could use his education. He was a very intelligent guy with a high IQ. He wasn't the guy you'd expect to see on the front line. But the fact of the matter was, he joined the rest of them. He didn't run away to Buchholz because he didn't want to be there. He picked up a weapon and he fired it the same as everyone else, and played his part in that day. It's funny as well, because when Warren Springer was liberated at the end of the war, he was still fairly fit and was able to submit his account of what happened on the 16th of December, whereas Lyle Barrett wasn't in a very good state on captivity. And but all 4 men of that artillery observation unit received the Silver Star in 1945, so they were decorated for their part. And of course, Billy Queen, for some reason, he got overlooked that evening when the fighting was over and the defenders of the ridge line were being brought down into the village, into the Cafe Palm, Cafe Scholzen. His body was left up there, and his body wasn't recovered until January 1945. And ironically, it was discovered by another Sea Battery forward observer. How ironic is that? One of your unit colleagues found his body a few weeks later in January, but for some reason it got overlooked during that evening. And I suppose the men, once they've been captured, had other things on their mind, what's going to happen next, and because their future seemed uncertain at that point. They've miraculously survived, albeit in bad shape, some of them. But Billy Queen, he was the only loss, the American loss that day at Lanzerath. The the night patrols. I bring this little section up. We're close to the end now. But the verbal altercation between von Hoffmann, which this is all about, and Piper. Piper marching into the. We have to clear something up first. The Café Palm, Café Scholzen. The German point of view, everything happened in the Café Palm. From the American point of view, and as it might appear now with Mike, that the Belgian civilians are referred to the Café Scholzen. So we know there are two cafes in Lanzerath at that period because they were identified by Dick Byers.
Right.
Germans, Café Palm, Americans, Café Scholzen. Who know? We you know, I was always, it was Café Palm, but it could be the Café Scholzen. And you can just imagine this confrontation, this meek, portly colonel who's found himself in command of a 9th Regiment just after midnight is confronted by Piper marching in his black leather, and his throat ache's been cured, and confronts this man who's a rank above him. And Arnold told me that he had a full transcript of verbal events that night, but he couldn't find it. Somebody had taken notes, and I really wanted to have a look at it, but again, it didn't bother me at the time what was said. It was the fact that Piper had a bad day and he was going to take it out on somebody, and when he came in and saw that the 9th Regiment wasn't doing very much and hadn't done much past Lanzerath, I think that might have thrown him over the edge. And the other thing as well is when he walked into that cafe, the men of the I&R platoon were in there, and with his future track record of what happened in the Ardennes, I think it's miraculous that he didn't put 2 and 2 together, that these prisoners are the ones that held up the 9th Regiment for almost the whole of the daylight hours. But he just appeared to be so task focused on what his objectives were, and this blindness to his end goal. I don't think he even noticed. In fact, Lyle Bouck and Piper became pen friends later on, years later. And I think Bouck invited Piper to their reunion in '69, but he politely declined. But anyway, the patrol. So one of the big things with the altercation between Piper and von Hoffmann in the Café Palm, Scholzen, was about the fact that no patrols had been carried out. When he was asked about had patrols been carried out, what is the state of the enemy resistance further up the road? And I think von Hoffmann bumbled a bit and said something about, yeah, well, a battalion commander was told by a company commander that there were lots of Americans around. But we know from the German text that there were at least 2 patrols that went out that night to see what was ahead of them. One from the 1st Company, which is the top account, and one from the 5th Company, from the 2nd Battalion, in the second one. Now, the first one, they didn't get that far, to be honest, on the way to Buchholz before they came under MG fire from inside the forest. And they turned around and came back because they weren't going to go into the forest after them. They didn't know how many MG positions were in there, so they fell back, created a security line, and then pulled back to the village. Now, whether they reported that or not, I don't know, because maybe von Hoffmann didn't know that the patrol had come back, and it was, they couldn't get much further. The other patrol was ordered personally by von Hoffmann, and it was given to the 5th Company. And they advanced in the direction of the Buchholz station, and they too came under really strong MG fire from the train station area. And if it wasn't for the fact that there was a flak officer with them, one of the officers was a flak officer, recipient of the Iron Cross First Class, who complained to the company commander that, we need to get closer to, to go to the right before we advance towards the station. And then because they came under so much fire, they too withdraw back to Lanzerath. And again, do they report? I don't know, but it gave something for Piper to have a go at Hoffmann about, because by the time Piper walks in just after midnight, most of the regiment are bedded down. But of course they weren't, because they were actually conducting patrols, and couldn't get any further. In fact, the 27th Fusilier Regiment was supposed to have taken Buchholz, but they couldn't do it either. There was a lot of resistance at that point. So if you look at it in the bigger scheme of things, the 9th Regiment had advanced more during the 16th than their neighbouring regiment had, themselves that first day.
Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating stuff. So we're kind of getting to the rounding things up now. People have been saying what an amazing presentation it's been, and Mike Smeets is again confirming that the cafe confusion is still it's not 100% clear. There's evidence for both. But yeah.
So we move on to the 17th, right? The 17th. Everybody knows what happened during the early hours of the 17th. That the 1st Battalion was seconded to Piper. They would ride on the Panzers, and the 2nd Battalion would provide flank security, and they would ride on through Buchholz to Honsfeld. Now, this photo, I sent a similar photograph from a different angle to Arnold Weisenberg, because he was going to visit Vince Kuhlbach and Sepp Reiner. And I got this back a few weeks later, because Sepp Reiner is the guy smoking on the back of the King Tiger 222 there with a SS dispatch rider. And when I've been looking at this week, and I've studied this photograph, and I think, well, there's a few things in there. One, Sepp Reiner was 14th Company, the anti-tank, the Panzerjäger guys. When we think about, it's just the 1st Battalion that rode on the tanks, the 14th Panzerjäger were there as well. But they're without Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. So, I don't know why they utilized the 14th Company. I do know that the 14th Company attracted some of the best men were seconded to the Panzerjäger Company. So perhaps they went along, because all these guys on the tank are veterans of Normandy or one of the campaigns along the way. So they were veterans. And this is the 17th of December, and it's daylight. So we know that Honsfeld was reached before light. So this may be before the American counterattack or whatever, but they seem to be in good spirits. They've just gone through what has been described by both sides as hell the previous day, the 16th, with quite a few losses, a lot of combat experience and gained in that one day. But they seem quite jovial. Now, that could be because in Honsfeld, there was a lot of booty in Honsfeld, not just cigarettes, coffee and rations of things, but vehicles. A lot of vehicles were taken in Honsfeld, which gave the 9th Regiment a bit of partial mobility as well, that they hadn't had up to that point for reconnaissance and things like that. And the other thing I looked at was the weather conditions in the background. If you look at the ground, it's like a really light scattering of snow. So again, we could be talking about different terrain. In the Honsfeld area, we got this what looks like a little white scattering of snow, but it also highlights the fact that these guys are just wearing their Fallschirmjäger uniforms. They're not wearing snow camouflage. They still haven't got them. And it says in Roppelt, there was light snow during the attack. This is on Lanzerath. Many of the 1st Battalion had not complied with the request to camouflage themselves with white sheets, cloths and towels or linen. So as they got further south on their march in prep for the Ardennes offensive, they'd received this order: if you can, go into the houses or whatever, or take off people, the German people, as you're going through, and gather all this stuff, because you're going to need it at some point, because they weren't getting proper snow camouflage issued, but they didn't. So hence why they went into battle without the proper snow camouflage. And the other interesting thing about that photograph was the guy closest to the camera carrying a Sten gun, which I thought was quite interesting. Somebody commented to me a few months ago when I published it on my Facebook page, there's a Mark II Sten gun. I don't know how you can tell it's a Mark II Sten gun from here, but I thought looks that was like quite...
Yeah, it looks like it, because the Mark III has a barrel casing down the front. Yeah, so yeah, it looks like a Mark II to me. Yeah.
Mark II gun. So I was quite... And also Vince Kuhlbach signed the back, because he had nothing more to add about that, because this was a 14th Company tank, and Vince himself was on another tank in part of Piper's convoy towards Honsfeld.
I mean, it's just pure speculation, Greg. The fact that they didn't adopt the snow camouflage when the previous day they literally have been fighting across fields where snow camouflage may have saved lives. is this maybe to do with that kind of esprit de corps, like British paras not wanting to take the red beret off? Because there's lots of these Volksgrenadiers in this advance, and they want to show off that they are Fallschirmjäger, they're something special, and their smocks are some kind of badge of accomplishment. Is that possibly it?
Yeah, well, Frühbeiser even mentions that they stood out in their mottled uniforms. And if you look at their neighbour, the 27th Fusilier Regiment, when the three guys from the INR platoon were captured by the 27th, they were wearing snow camouflage. The 27th Fusilier Regiment wearing. So they'd obviously, the 12th Volksgrenadier Division had obviously issued out snow camouflage, yet the 3rd Parachute Division didn't, or the 9th Regiment didn't anyway. Yeah, so yeah, maybe it was something to do with esprit de corps. They didn't, that was their uniform they were proud of. Maybe they didn't want to cover it up. They wanted the enemy to see them for who they were, perhaps. I don't know. But it cost them a lot of losses that day.
Yeah. It's well,
and when it says that many of the battalion had not complied with the request, so they probably thought, don't need it, won't need it. Why should we cover up our uniforms? Who knows? And I have to meeting in Stadkill, Junkerath on the 11th of December 1969 was organised by Frühbeiser and invited members of the 99th Division for a sort of reunion of former enemies. It's mentioned in more detail in The Longest Winter, but this was, I think this might be written by Schenk zu Schweinsberg, who was the battalion commander. I'm lucky I said that, to be honest. If I'd been drinking wine, I would never have got it out. And in fact, Schenk zu Schweinsberg, Gundolf Freiherr Schenk zu Schweinsberg, who was the battalion commander, wrote the letter of condolence to Heinz Fick's widow in 1946 and explained to her what happened, how Heinz Fick was killed. But anyway, he says on the occasion of an Ardennes meeting in Junkerath Stadkill on the 11th of December 1969, the fighters of that time remembered that hazy day on which the 1st Battalion, 9th Regiment went into their assembly area in the very early hours of the 16th of December 44. Our opponent, the then US 99th Division, attended the 1969 meeting. It can thus be said that no Jäger Latein were told on that day. So that literally translates as hunter's tales. So you can instantly know what hunter's tales are. And I asked my old friend Manfred Muller, who's a post-war Fallschirmjäger veteran, and he put it, as you could outside of the context of just hunter's Latin. Hunter's Latin, but hunter's tales. The word is used or considered the exaggerated representation of an event or experience with widespread use amongst hunters and anglers, the fish that got away. In the context you mentioned, it would mean that the narration about the event was not exaggerated, but actually took place as described. So you can imagine that day, this social event where the beers are flying, they've done all their ceremonial wreath laying and things like that. And I believe the German delegation, when they went to lay wreaths in Belgium, had to get permission from the King of Belgium to actually lay the wreaths. I read that from Arnold. But you can imagine that they're not holding back on, what happened that day in Lanzerath. But strangely enough, only Lyle Bouck went from the INR platoon. None of the other men went. It was only Lyle Bouck that went along with other 99th Division members. So they were talking not just about Lanzerath, but Buchholz Station, where 99th were, and Honsfeld. But I'd love to have been a fly on the wall that day.
Absolutely. And it's another reminder that American veterans 25 years on are able to make the distinction between different types of Germans they would have encountered in that battle. And the SS and the atrocities they committed are separately considered in their minds through Fallschirmjäger. And the fact that 99 Division guys are happy to go over to Europe and meet up with these guys, it confirms that understanding that the Americans in this battle could make those distinctions among the quality of the men they're talking they fought against. Because the question came up in the sidebar about whether or not the Fallschirmjäger would have had those same no prisoner orders, and of course the answer is generically yes. That's the order given to the advance there, but different units have their different ways of undertaking those campaigns, and we know, generally speaking, Fallschirmjäger had a kind of an honor honorable way of treating warfare. I mean, people will pick me up and they're bound to pull out certain incidents, but generally speaking, every Allied veteran I ever met who fought against the Fallschirmjäger, 6th Fallschirmjäger, 3rd Fallschirmjäger, has a level of respect for them.
Definitely,
which is worth mentioning, I think.
Yeah, well, you see that now with the Battle of Crete. You know, a lot of German veterans went on to become members of the New Zealand Veterans Association.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you wouldn't see an SS, a union of American troops and SS troops. You know, that just wouldn't.
Yeah. Imagine 25 years on from Arnhem. You know, 9th and 10th SS meeting up with parachute regiment guys. That wasn't going to happen. You know, it's a very different understanding. So, but yeah, we'll bring things to an end in a minute. So this is your final slide. So
this is my final slide because I think this is a good end to Heinz Fick's perspective of the state of the 9th Regiment. He's pulled out of the line early January with a stomach issue and spends a few days in the rear in a field hospital, and before he comes back to his unit. After a long car trip, I'm now back where I had put my new captain and my first secretary on the 1st of January. What I found there was upsetting. After severe attacks from the Americans, almost nothing is left of the battalion. The remnants of my company managed to get through. Some of them are with the neighbouring regiment, the 8th Regiment, and the others are stationed with another battalion. The captain who was replacing me as commander while I was away has been taken prisoner. So now all I have left to carry on with is the supply vehicles and my good man Gurka, that must be his Batman, and 2 excellent boys from my troop, who are now my constant companions. I reported to the regiment commander, Oberst von Hoffmann, and he gave me the command of a small posse of men, the regimental reserves, to man in case for counterattack. May the Almighty give me and my men a successful outcome in case we are called up. The entire proud regiment is now reduced to a fighting troop where captains lead no more than 50 men. The men have been in foxholes and in the snowy woods for days without being able to warm up, without any food, without any relief. Nonetheless, the positions have to be held and must be held with those that are still left. In secret and between ourselves, we all long to be relieved by a fresh, strong troop of men that would get us out. May the Almighty give us soon an improvement in our situation, for the troops are suffering from severe exhaustion. However, we are Prussian soldiers and hope for the best. So at the moment, I am in a regimental attack post, find out minute by minute what our situation is. There is much more I could tell you, but next to me sits the sergeant, and right next to him are the phones, and there is a constant to and fro while I am writing. I keep an ear cocked to the conversations all around me, and I think I'd better close for today. And the ironic thing about that's dated on the 17th, and he is seriously wounded the next day outside the church in Amel by artillery fire, and he dies in the field hospital 2 days later on the 20th. So he never got to get home, and like many other men from different countries, to tell his wife and his family about his experiences, and he never got to see Heinrich, his son, who was born just under 6 months later. So quite poignant letter showing the state of what he'd returned to after the fighting had almost fizzled out by that point, or had done really. They were on the back. But yeah, so thanks to Heinrich to allow me to utilize his letters. They're very interesting.
No, that's fantastic stuff, and and it's a perfect way to end the show, because sure, we did the show last night about the massacre, but there are still people on the German side who have families. They believe they want to aim for peace. They want to bring this to an end, and it's just reminding us that these are human beings involved in this. Some of the SS who committed the atrocities were not human beings; they were something else. But a lot of guys, these foot soldiers, were just there doing their job, and we can kind of see that now with the benefit of 77 years. So, amazing stuff, Greg. And as usual, it's been an incredibly detailed presentation. I'm just going to remind people what we got coming up, and I will say goodbye in a second. So, folks, tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. UK, 2 p.m. Eastern, we are talking with John Bernstein about the 9th Air Force in the Ardennes. So talk about the air superiority that was unfortunately lacking at some points because of the weather. We've touched on that with Greg. We touched on that with Peter. I remind you that this series of shows is sponsored by battlemaps.us. The descriptions in the details in the description below. If you go to the website, link below, and put in World War II TV, you get a discount code if you buy any of their fantastic prints of maps, of historical maps and charts from around the world. Worth having a look at. Fantastic website. As for everything else, don't forget to follow us on social media. Consider becoming a patron if you are not already. Consider becoming a member of the YouTube channel if you are not already. Consider buying Greg's book on Fallschirmjäger if you have not already. And otherwise, just keep on sharing the word of what we're doing. You have noticed there has been an increase in views over the last few weeks. I do feel with the upward curve is still going. I'm hoping that next year, 2022, will be even better for World War II TV. But for those of you that have joined us right from the beginning and showed that loyalty all the way through, thank you so much for sticking with us, because it's been a lot of work for all of us, for me, for my guests, the work people like Greg put into these presentations. This is deserving of a bigger audience, and we hope we will get there at some point. But right now, Greg, thank you very much for joining us again, and I can't wait for your next email or message when you say, I've got another idea for you, Paul, we're going to look at. And we will do that next year. So that'll be good. So Merry Christmas to you and yours. And folks,
and to everyone,
see you all again tomorrow. Cheers then, Greg. Cheers, everybody. See you again next time. Bye, everybody. Have a good evening.